Thank you for everyone. Hopefully you can hear me for joining us this evening. I'm Sandy Shapiro, along here with Faye Hedrick, representing the Society of Healers. And Society of Healers is one subpart of the Jewish Federation and Foundation, which is here for the entire community to strengthen, serve, support, and help you feel connected and unified, not just in our local Jewish community, but to the larger world. And we hope that by you joining us this evening, we can bring you the most current information on COVID-19 and the vaccine. We actually had a lot of constituents reaching out to us after our phenomenal presentation that we had back in March with Dr. Koren. And so together with questions submitted from the community to us, my partner, Jill Metlin, and I got together and with Faye, and we asked Dr. Koren if he would again, and he has graciously accepted us to do it again for us. We appreciate that. And so he's going to go over some of the questions that were asked by the community. And then following that, we will be sure to include some time for brief questions and answers.
Thanks, Sandy. Dr. Michael Koren is a practicing cardiologist and the Chief Executive Officer at Jacksonville Center for Clinical Research, which conducts clinical trials at 8 different locations here in Florida. Dr. Koren received his medical degree cum laude at Harvard Medical School and completed his residency in internal medicine and fellowship in cardiology at New York Hospital, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, Cornell Medical Center. He is a fellow of the American College of Cardiology, fellow and 2-time president of the Academy of Physicians in Clinical Research, as well as, you've got a long bio here. You should be very proud. You're quite accomplished.
I'm just a country doctor.
And he's a really nice guy.
Yeah.
Dr. Koren has served as an investigator in over 2,000 trials. That's probably an old number now to date, not today. Without further ado, I introduce you to Dr. Michael Koren.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Faye, for arranging this. And we have a small but elite group of present people that are going to help me present this information to the rest of the community. And we're really, really excited about this. Oh my God, the last 2 weeks has been just mind-boggling in terms of the amount of information that has come out about the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we're going to try to sort through that. You can imagine the type of questions that we're getting here on a daily basis from incredible extremes. That we've had questions about, should I take my 4th dose of the vaccine? And we've had questions about, tell me how this is changing my DNA. So it's from one extreme to another that we're getting questions. So hopefully we can go through the information and help everybody understand really what they should know at this point. And it changes every day. So we may have to do this again next week. So one of the things that we like to do here, and hopefully everybody can see the slides, is have these regular meetings where we share information with the community. We share information with the community in a way that really digs into medical evidence. And unfortunately, if you get your medical information from typical media channels, you're really just getting these headlines. I had a fascinating conversation with one of my good buddies who actually writes for the San Francisco Chronicle. I had dinner with him a couple of nights ago. And he was a little bit ashamed about how he's being taught to write these days, which is to throw out a headline that gets eyeballs and clicks. And then you get to the story, you quote a couple of people, and then you actually get to the story with the facts in the 5th and 6th paragraph. So you can imagine that it's sometimes hard to sort through all this information and really get to the point where you understand what is relevant for you and your family. And because of that just challenge of the modern environment, we've created this MedEvidence Hour. And that's our brand name for these type of chats where we really dig into the details of any medical issue. And right now we're doing it with relationship to COVID-19 and other viral outbreaks, which is all the rage. But we do this for heart disease and orthopedic problems and for gastrointestinal problems, et cetera. So we would invite you, if you're interested in this type of format, to join our community, which has about 100,000 people around the country right now that gets involved in these programs on a regular basis and really dig into the data. The other thing that we like to talk about, this concept of taking a medical question and really drilling into it, is really an ancient type of endeavor. This has been going on for literally thousands of years. And here's a picture of Socrates and his disciples digging into the issue of the day, the philosophical issues of the day. And we actually use some of that ancient wisdom in the way we like to present information here in our organization. So Fortunately, Socrates didn't have the problem of advancing slides. Oops. There we go. And so the rules of the room tonight are listed here. That works better. So we have a small group, but the way we usually do these particular programs is that we do invite a small live audience so that there is interaction and people can ask their questions. And sometimes you learn things about how people are thinking about an issue better when you can see their face and see their body language. And that also makes it, I think, a little bit more interesting for the general Zoomosphere to see how people are interacting and maybe get some insights based on that. Everybody here has been vaccinated. We're socially distant. And again, we use what's called the modified Socratic method, where we use a question as a tool to dig into an issue. So with that, and without further ado, and with connectivity problems, we're going to go ahead and ask.
I don't know why it's not working.
Is the first question, is COVID-19 worse now than ever? So what do you guys think?
It's more contagious.
Okay, well, I would agree with that. Any thoughts? Is it worse now than ever?
I think we know more about it now, so that's a positive than we did when it first began.
And we have more treatments out there.
Okay. So, I would agree with that. So basically, the sentiment of the room is that the answer is yes and no. So, and I'll show you the data. There are some things about it that's actually worse now than ever, but there's a lot of things about it that are not as bad, and largely because we have much more knowledge about how to deal with it. In the early days of COVID-19, we were putting people on ventilators early, which turned out to be a disaster. We're using therapies that really didn't work. And we were really just flying by the seat of our pants in terms of how to deal with it. There was a lot of mistakes made in terms of basic public health policies early on. And I think those have gotten much, much better. We have approved treatments for people who get sick, and that makes a big, big difference. And the mortality rate has gone way down. On the other hand, we're dealing with a much more contagious variant right now that's just spreading around the world like wildfire, spreading actually much more rapidly than the previous variants. So the answer is yes and no. So digging into that a little bit more. Next slide, please. Everything is local, they say, and here is the statistics for Florida. And you can see that we were very fortunate in the early days of the pandemic in that while some of the country was experiencing very high rates of infection in March and April of last year, we were in much better shape. We had our first serious wave back in the early summer months of last year. Things calmed down. And then during the holiday season, we had a very, very significant increase in rates right as the vaccines were becoming available. So it's a little bit frustrating that we had the emergency authorization of vaccines, but the cases were raging, and it was a race to get the vaccines out as quickly as possible. Things calmed down. In fact, about 2 or 3 months ago, we were seeing extremely low rates of infection here in Florida. And I think there was a little complacency with that, quite frankly. Unfortunately, with the outbreak of the Delta variant, we'll talk much more about it, we've now seen case numbers that are as high as ever in Florida, in fact, more than ever in Florida. And the hospitals here in Florida are busier than ever. And the case positivity rate in Florida is the highest it's ever been. So in the worst parts of the previous surges, we were seeing case positivity rates of between 10 and 15%. And now across the state, we're seeing 20%. And in places where we didn't get hit hard before, including Duval County, St. Johns County, Clay, we're now seeing rates 25% and higher. So people who get, anybody who's symptomatic with viral type symptoms has a 1 in 4 chance of having COVID at this point, whereas it was 1 in 10 a year ago. So those are ways of thinking about how things actually have gotten worse.
Hey, I clicked. Or did you do that?
All right, let's see if this works. I think we did it. Now, fortunately, as I mentioned, we're treating the cases much more effectively than we did previously. So even though the case numbers are as high as they ever were, the death rate hasn't equaled the death rate that we were seeing a year ago. And this is really a reflection of just much, much better treatment. Also, there's an epidemiological phenomenon. And this is one thing that Florida did really, really well, is that this is a virus that affects older, vulnerable people in a much more intense way than younger, healthier people. Not all viruses are like that. I always like to remind people that 100 years ago, we had the Spanish flu pandemic, and that was much more likely to kill a healthy 18-year-old male than it was a 70-year-old man, because of the cytokine storm issue with that particular virus. So that answers that question. But if you go to, it's interesting, if you go to graveyards, especially in military towns, people that came back from World War I, you'll see all these grave markers with young men between 18 and 24. So every virus is different. The other thing about the Spanish flu pandemic is that there's a belief that older people still had some immunity to a previous flu pandemic that occurred 50 years earlier, whereas younger people didn't have that protection. But the point being is that every viral outbreak has its unique characteristics. And you have to know those characteristics, learn about them as quickly as possible, and then put public health measures in place. So for example, in Florida, very early on during the pandemic, the nursing homes were locked down. That didn't happen in New York, and they suffered from that. That was a very, very good public health move. On the other hand, New York is doing much better now compared to Florida in terms of vaccination rates. And so I wish that we would do better on that. And that's one of my goals, is to raise awareness about that. So, but we'll get to that. So as a comparison, New York, and I bring New York because it's actually a similar size state, about 20 million people, a little bit bigger than New York these days. A similar density, actually, in terms of population per square mile. And you can see that they had that very early spike, and then they had the huge surge in late last year. And they're also experiencing a Delta surge, but it's not as much as in Florida. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that they have more vaccinated people in New York as a percentage of the population. And two, they probably have more immune people because people are previously infected. And previous infection is protective against the Delta variant. Not 100% protective, but highly protective. And you can see when you look at daily deaths in New York, it was a real disaster, over a year and a half ago. Just, it was absolute chaos in terms of what was going on in the hospitals there, what was going on in the nursing homes there, and a lot of mistakes were made. And again, there was an increase in numbers certainly during the surge at the ends of last year, but not so much right now. So you can see the benefit of experience and doing things better from a public health viewpoint as things move forward. It's funny that this doesn't seem to like to work. All right, so Florida is now reporting their numbers on a weekly basis. And again, we see some good news, we see some bad news. So overall, there have been about 3 million Floridians who have been diagnosed with COVID-19 based on serology information coming from commercial labs here. And that's probably an underestimation of the total burden. But nonetheless, we know at least 3 million people have gotten the virus based on a positive test. But this is the number that is really, really highly concerning. As I mentioned, the percentage positive of all the tests that are coming out is about 20% right now. And that's not good. That's really not good. And the pandemic is considered under control when that rate is less than 3%. So we got a long, long way to go to get this thing back under control. Florida is doing okay compared to the other states around the country, but not nearly as good as some of the states that have very high vaccination rates. Some of the states now have vaccination rates north of 70%. We're about 50% here in Florida. So we got some work to do there. And we're making some progress. I can show you that this latest surge has been a wake-up call for a lot of people. I think that they're now responding, and I'll actually show you the numbers for that in a second. But there is a problem. And the problem is that we have this group of people who are 12 and under that don't have a solution. And that's really significant. I'm going to talk about that a couple of times tonight, but that's 10 or 15% of our population are youngish kids, and they don't have a solution right now. And so how that plays out is really, really important in terms of when we get back to a more normal time period in terms of our day-to-day activities. On the other hand, in Florida, you can see that the most vulnerable people are doing really quite well. So if you're 60 and over, then you have an 80% plus vaccination rate. So that's really, really good. That the most vulnerable people are responding to the data and they are getting vaccinated. But we have a lot of work to do in younger populations, and we have a dilemma in the super young people. So this slide shows you new case rates for the last 10 weeks in Florida. And fortunately, over the last 2 weeks, it's kind of stabilized at about 150,000 new cases. So hopefully this latest surge is now cresting. and hopefully we'll see it come down. And I'm feeling fairly optimistic about it. This number is probably the most important, that it stopped going up. So what you're seeing that we got up to about 19-20% in positivity rate, and that's not going up any further. So that's usually a sign that you're at your plateau. And the hope then is that will start to come down. As I mentioned, vaccination rates have now picked up quite again because of the surge. So we did really well in the beginning of the year, Florida. We were actually equal to or maybe even a little bit better than most states. And then we kind of got complacent. And you can see actually with complacency that from June to July, the number of people who are getting vaccinated each week dropped by almost half. And as the vaccine became available to younger people, they just weren't taking the opportunity to get vaccinated. And as you also can see is that with the surge, people kind of woke up. So we went from 238,000 vaccines per week up to 436,000 vaccines per week. So we're very, very fortunate here in the US and certainly in Florida in that we have vaccines for everybody. Very few countries can say that. So we're blessed and people should take advantage of that. And my number one take home message is get vaccinated. And we're going to jump into the data a little bit more, but getting that first dose is by far the most important thing we can do from a public health standpoint. Nothing is even close to that. All right, so that's question one. A long-winded way of answering a question, but any thoughts about that? Good and bad, would you agree? Mm-hmm. Okay. Question number two, do vaccines work against the variant? So who wants to give their sense for that?
I agree, they do.
Mm-hmm.
My thought process was when the vaccine was initially out, it was based upon the initial strain of the virus that we had out there, and that tested, it was found to be 95% effective. Knowing that now moving forward, you have these different variants. So is it still effective against those? I would say absolutely, but this is also based on looking at the data from East Coast to West Coast and all the hospitals. Over 90% of the patients who are being admitted for COVID are not vaccinated. Mm-hmm. To me, that says the vaccine is working. It's not keeping you from getting sick, but it is keeping you out of the hospital. Now, my question is, and maybe you'll address
well, let me stop you there. Okay. That was brilliant. Do you want to switch seats?
No.
No, that was spot on. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So the question is, though, and hopefully you'll talk, because this has come up a lot, is how many of those patients who are in the hospital actually had COVID mm-hmm. as part of their immunity, but still were in the hospital. So we don't know. Is there only one? Are these people that are virgin?
Sure.
You know.
Yeah. Do they have antibodies at any point? Yeah, I understand.
Right. So,
yeah. Yeah. And it's a great question, and we can kind of answer that. This side of the room has to work a little bit too. So, what do you guys think? Oh. So what? Do you have a sense, Sandy, about the variants? The vaccine's a complete disaster against the variants, or what have you heard?
I've heard that if you're vaccinated, that you're less likely to die in the hospital, and that's what everyone keeps saying as well. I'm not going to die if I'm vaccinated.
Okay. Have there been any news reports lately on that?
There have been people who have been vaccinated and have died, unfortunately.
Sure. Yeah. How about news reports about the efficacy of the vaccine for Delta variant? Sharon.
Something came out just yesterday.
Really?
Oh,
and what was that?
And I know that you're going to cover it.
Yes.
But the news articles the headlines are saying the vaccine was efficacious 95% against the original, and it's dropped down to 70 or something for the Delta.
And those are great points. I think actually you guys did a great job in capturing that. I think pretty much everything you said is accurate, but I'm going to drill into that a little bit more. So the 95% number came out. Does anyone know where that comes from?
Clinical trials.
Exactly. And that's going to be a really, really important point. The 70%, where does that come from?
I don't know.
Well, we're going to look at that. All right. So this is good. I like this. These are good questions.
Ask someone who's virtually on if they might know. Are they muted or unmuted?
It's just hard. It's hard to do that. They could text. But
yeah, they're muted. They can just
I'm looking at the chat, so if
Okay.
they want to put something in the
Yeah,
chat.
if you
I'll-
see,
I'll
if you
do
see
it.
something in the chat that someone blurted out for them, but otherwise it gets a little chaotic. All right. So again, whatever reason this. Okay, so this is actually going to answer all those questions. So a report was mentioned on Friday that came from the CDC that was looking at healthcare workers at 8 different locations to see who was getting sick, and they were being screened every week. So we have pretty good data on whether or not they're positive. Obviously, you could miss some cases because you can be positive in between screens, and some people miss screens, but it's a decent way of looking at that. But it's not a clinical trial. It's an observational study. So that, and we're going to talk about what that means. So one of the first things that you need to know when you're looking at news reports, is this a clinical trial or not? And the reason for that is a clinical trial is the most scientific way to answer a question, because everybody's blinded. You're asking the question, there are no predetermined biases. And at the end of the day, you're looking at data, comparing one group versus another when you don't know who's who. That is the most rigorous standard. The media reports that came out based on the CDC study, which is not a clinical trial, observational study, are interesting, but it's not considered the highest level of evidence. So let's look at actually the numbers. Now, before I get into these numbers, I can just remind you about the clinical trial that we did here in Jacksonville. We worked here in this physical location on the Pfizer study, the Pfizer vaccine study, and the Moderna vaccine studies, and the Novavax studies. So we did 3 major clinical trials here on COVID-19 vaccines. And if you recall, and I mentioned this at our last session, for the Pfizer vaccine study, it's 95% effective based on a very specific equation. And that equation is that you look at all the people who got sick in the placebo group, and then you look at the number of people that got sick in the treated group. And so, for example, if 100 people got sick in the placebo group and 5 people got sick in the treated group, that's 95% effective. You protected 95% of people you expected to protect. If 50% of people were sick in the placebo, 50% of people were sick in the treated group and 100 still in the placebo group, it's 50% effective. Okay, so it's the actual vaccine efficacy is a real number that's calculated in a very, very specific way, actually a relatively simple way. Now, when they do things in observational studies, it's more of a hypothesis or an estimate. It's not a real number. Now, again, it's based on observational data, but the uncertainty is far greater because there's variables that are not equally controlled between 2 groups. So the concept of the clinical trials is that stuff happens in life, right? Things change. So you have different variants. You have you have different weather patterns. You have holidays. You have all these things that can affect our lives. But it happens equally to the placebo group and the treated group. We call that randomization. That protects the scientific integrity. When you do an observational study, you don't have that level of scientific ability to answer questions. Make sense? That's why the first thing you should look at when you look at a report, is it a clinical trial? Is it a double-blind placebo-controlled clinical trial, which is considered the highest level of medical evidence? And it's rare that that information is changed or overturned because it turns out to be really, really robust. We may have better therapies, things in life can change, but that observation rarely is going to change. Whereas in observational studies, if you have a different set of circumstances, the outcomes can change. That's one thing. The second thing is that the CDC data came out about 4 or 5 days after the headline. So I remember I got the headline on Friday. I'm looking at it and say, well, this is interesting. They told me that the vaccines are only 66% protective against the Delta variant. That's concerning. But I didn't have any numbers to look at. So now we do. This came out yesterday, and I'm going to try to walk you through it here. But first of all, one of the things that you need to know when you look at these things is looking at the total number of observations, which is here is called the total number of person days, the number of days that can be accounted for based on the study design. Again, remembering this is 8 sites in the US, which is pretty representative, but testing only once a week. So there could be missed cases. And then you actually have the number of infections over here. So to remind you, for the Pfizer study that I referenced, the difference between placebo and vaccinated was 162 infections in placebo, 8 infections in vaccinated. 162 versus 8. That was the 95%. Pretty dramatic. It was mind-blowing, to be honest with you. So keep those numbers in mind. So here you can see that when they looked at the full cohort, there was a huge difference between unvaccinated people, 194, and vaccinated 34. Despite the fact, and this is the difference between observational data and clinical trials. In clinical trials, both groups are going to have about the same numbers. But in this observation, most of the people were vaccinated. So you can see that there were more than 2 times as many observations amongst vaccinated people than unvaccinated people. In fact, almost 3 times as many. So despite this difference in the number of observations, the number of infections was way, way, way higher in unvaccinated people. So the take-home message, again, is get vaccinated. Okay, so that's the first take-home message. Okay, so then the other thing was it was about how long does the vaccine last? That was the question. And when you look at that particular question, you have all these changing factors. And what was the biggest changing factor over the last 3 months? Delta. Okay, so we're actually talking about a different virus. It's a related virus, but it's a different virus. So when you do an observational study, how difficult is it to make a solid conclusion when the disease has changed during the course of the study? It's very difficult. So you don't know.
Someone texted me earlier, actually. How do you know if you've tested positive for the Delta variant or?
Right. Yeah, well, you don't know, except that we know epidemiologically that virtually all the infections now are Delta. So in the state of Florida, over 90% of the infections are a Delta variant at this point. And then we saw the same thing in India where it started, in the UK where it came through, in Israel and in other places, is that when Delta hit, it took over. It became the dominant strain. That's a good question. So getting back to this, so now we're looking at the pre-Delta variant predominance. This is the period of time before Delta hit. And you can see most of the information and most of the infections comes from that period. But of course, Delta is the name of the game right now. So you can see that they have some information here about the Delta predominance. And given the more recent history, you can see that the huge discrepancy between unvaccinated and vaccinated has dropped off a bit. Again, keep in mind that these are way smaller numbers than here, and there's still way more observations. There's about 5 times as many observations in vaccinated people than unvaccinated patients. And despite this huge difference in number of observations, these numbers are about the same. But here's the key. This is the key that you will not see in any of the media items, which is actually the most important thing when you're a medical scientist that looks at these things. It's called the 95% confidence interval. So this 66% efficacy here is a guess. And it's a guess based on numbers that are presented here that are relatively small numbers. But a good statistician, any study that gets into any decent journal, will have a confidence interval. And what the confidence interval says is, okay, well, this is our best guess based on the data we have, but what are the overall likelihood of numbers? What's the range of numbers that would be conceivable with 95% confidence? And if you look at it, the actual number with 95% confidence is between 26 and 84%. Did you see that in the media report? Did they say? So you didn't see that in any media report. So there's a rule of thumb that we use when we make a decision about whether or not a medical finding is significant. And that means that the confidence intervals don't overlap. Okay, so if the 95% confidence interval, one thing is between 80 and 90, and the other thing is between 92 and 96, they don't overlap. So those are different numbers statistically. But if you look at these numbers, they all overlap.
What were they in the trials?
The confidence intervals, they didn't come close to overlapping, but the confidence interval, the rate, I didn't tell you the rate of infection. I told you there's 162 infections for the the placebo group in the Pfizer study versus 8 in the vaccinated group. But that, remember, that was 162 out of 20,000. So the actual rate is that 162 divided by 20,000 and 8 divided by 20,000. So the actual rates are very, very small, but the relative difference in rates was monstrous and was highly statistically significant. But anyhow, these are the kind of things that researchers look at. And you can see here that you heard a lot about, well, now you should get your booster shot 8 months after vaccination. Well, I don't know where that number came from, to be honest with you. But you can see here that if you look at people that were fully vaccinated and 150 days after their full vaccination, which means that they're about, that would be approximately 6 months after they start to become immune. You can see that they're adjusting the vaccine efficacy to 73%. But look at the interval; it's between 49 and 86. If you're, if you just got a vaccine between 14 and 119 days, you're at 85% efficacious. But look at the interval; it's actually between 68 and 93. Do those two numbers overlap? They sure do. So in science, in a medical scientific journal, it would say this is not statistically significant. There's no difference between those numbers. That's what scientists would say. But that's not what you're hearing in the media. So it's very, very interesting. And this is why people get confused, is that it gets to the concept of the level of scientific evidence. So see if the slides are moving forward here. And this is the most important slide I'm going to show you today. It's about the levels of medical evidence. So click through it. Okay. Oh, there we go.
You want me to go back and?
No, that's fine. You
and
can,
keep those doing?
yeah, that's fine. Up. Now you went too far. Let me go back. There.
I think we're both pressing it.
Go ahead.
Go for it. I
You
should work
drive.
for you.
You drive.
You.
I drive. Okay. You see, mine's not working.
All right, I'll drive. I'll drive. Okay, we're pressing at the same time. I know we are.
I'm going to take this very dangerous tool out of my hands. There we go.
There you go.
All right. So you're going to drive from here on.
All good at different things.
Yeah, that's right. There you go. You might have to do a breathalyzer test on me before I leave. I didn't have the wine yet. Anyway, so this is actually the most important slide I'm going to show you throughout this entire lecture. This has to do with level of evidence. As I mentioned, the highest level of evidence is level 1, and that's an experimental study, randomized, placebo-controlled clinical trial, randomized clinical trial. And again, the power of randomization is that stuff happens. You can't control the stuff that happens, but it's going to happen equally to the two comparison groups. That's the power of a randomized clinical trial. And that's what we do here. That, our whole business is around running randomized clinical trials. What I showed you from the CDC is called a cohort study. It's good. It generates hypotheses. It gives people a little bit of a sense, but it's not the same level of evidence. And as I showed you, when you look at the statistical analysis of that, you see that overlap. So from a rigorous scientific standpoint, we would call that a non-significant finding, interestingly. And then you have other things. Level 3 is that I have 3 friends that got COVID that were vaccinated. Okay, well, that's something. It means, what you can say from that is that a vaccine is not 100% protective, right? You can make that statement, but you can't say that the vaccine is a complete disaster, can you? So it's interesting. That gives you some information, but it's a lower level of evidence. And then level 4 is just, the opinion of really smart people that have studied this for long. So again, level 4 evidence was, let's put COVID-19 people on ventilators in March of 2020, because the smart people at the time said, well, maybe we should rest the lungs of these people. We're really smart. We've seen a lot of viruses. We haven't seen this one, but we've seen a lot of viruses, and we think this might work. No, that was the expert opinion for a very brief period of time, but it ended up, unfortunately, doing harm. And then level 5 is the level of evidence that I hear from most of my patients. Like when I'll look at their list of meds, and typically on a lot of supplements, and I'll say, well, why are you taking this crazy supplement? And they'll say, oh, my neighbor said it was good. Well, that's level 5 evidence. And, there's something to it. We're human beings, we get influenced by things, and sometimes it feels like you're doing something by doing something, but we consider that the lowest level of evidence.
Facebook group.
There you go.
Yeah, Facebook told me to do it.
Next slide, please.
Dr. Facebook.
All right, so we've mentioned already this concept about breakthrough infections, and The truth is that we have people in this community and many others that have gotten infections even though they've been fully vaccinated. And I showed you that that does occur. It's way less likely to occur than getting infected if you're unvaccinated, but it does occur. And so just so you know, the definition of a breakthrough case is you test positive for COVID-19 despite being fully vaccinated. And what's interesting about the Delta variant we're finding is that it probably generates very high concentrations of viral load in the nose. The number of viruses in the nose can be way, way, way higher than the alpha variant or the wild type. And for that reason, that may be the key to its infectivity. So one of the theories out there is that when you're vaccinated, your immune system is protecting you from systemic infection, from getting into your body and your bloodstream and your lungs, but it can still multiply in your nose, in your mouth. So the important part of that is that even though you're vaccinated, you can still pass the infection. You have the capability of being infectious and transmitting the virus, and that's important. So precautions still need to be put in place. And also because of these high viral loads, you're more likely with the Delta variant to transmit it than you would be for the other variants. And that's probably why the Delta variant is showing the numbers we're seeing right now with these big surges, because it's so transmissible. Next bullet point. Contagious would be another transmissible and contagious, yes.
For the lay.
Absolutely.
like- yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Contagious is a very good word. The Delta variant is more contagious. And what do breakthrough infections mean? This is the big question right now, and this is what everybody's talking about. Does it mean that the immunity decreases over time? Does it mean that the immunity may vary by individuals? Does it vary by virus strain and variants? Well, breakthrough infections definitely there's a difference in breakthrough infections by virus strain and variant. But even that's tricky, because I just told you that 90% of the infections right now are Delta. So is that because the vaccines are wearing down, or is it because Delta is different? We don't know. We don't know. Now, our best guess, expert opinion, is that it's probably that Delta is different. But the truth is that unless you do a randomized clinical trial, you don't know. The good news is we're doing a randomized clinical trial right here. So we just finished enrolling, and thank you for people in the community that have been part of this. We just enrolled 200 people in the Pfizer third dose booster study. So we're doing a clinical trial, and we should have results of that in the next 6 to 8 weeks. So before you rush out and get that booster, you might want to wait till we get the actual information, which will be level 1 evidence, and we'll be able to tell you, hey, the boosters work or they're not necessary. We'll be able to tell you that in 2 months based on the highest standard of evidence.
So can I stop you right there?
Please.
Because they are, I mean, obviously for those who are immunocompromised, have already been able to go out and receive their third dose.
Mhm.
And so there has not been studies done on those yet? Or
Correct.
this is still in theory that it probably does wear down and you should probably go ahead and get it.
It's all theory. It's
Okay.
based on expert opinion.
Okay.
Now, there is a little level, expert opinion member is level 4 evidence. There's a little bit of level 3 evidence. And
Right.
level 3 evidence is that we know antibody levels go up
Right,
when you take a third dose.
right.
But keep in mind, antibodies is just one element of immunity. So antibodies is what's called B cell immunity, which is a type of lymphocyte that's responsible for producing the antibodies. But B cells don't work unless you have T lymphocytes that are also identifying the infection and telling the B cells what to do. So immunity is a complex process that requires multiple elements of your body's immune system to work. So again, we do know antibody levels go up, and we think that's a good thing. And we know that people that take a third dose don't get too sick. One of the concerns would be you do a third dose and you're sending people to the hospital because of reactions from a third dose. We're not seeing that. So we know that the reactogenicity is the word that we use in medicine, is not that much different for both Pfizer and Moderna for the third dose as compared to the second dose. So that's good. So the short-term side effects, another way of saying that, is less than it could have been. And that's an important piece of the puzzle. We actually don't know if it works. Next slide. All right, so we're into the booster talk already. So who should get the booster? So again, consensus, because we don't have a clinical trial to tell us exactly what to do. the consensus is that the most high-risk people should get a booster. And those most high-risk people are considered people that have immune deficiency. So right now, that's the recommendation. So if you're getting cancer chemotherapy, for example, you should get a booster. If you have immune deficiency syndromes with input from your physicians, of course, you should get the booster. But healthy adults probably shouldn't. And a lot of healthy adults are nervous about it and they're doing it, but there's really no data to suggest that they need to get the third dose. Now, there was a statement from the federal government that they would pay for a third dose starting in September if you had more than 8 months time lag from the last one. And that's not based on any clinical trial. It's just based on, and again, I really don't get political in these discussions, but politicians have to show they're doing something. You know, that's how they're viewed. And so by having the government pay for a third dose, then we have the sense that they're doing something, even though there's no proven efficacy of that. There is some consensus opinion that will help the most high-risk people, but we just don't know. But there is a danger. Keep on the next slide of just rushing and getting a third dose. And you might not think about it. So here's my slide about booster facts and fiction. Keep on going. Okay. So antibody levels do increase with the third dose. That's been proven for both Pfizer BioNTech, and for Moderna. So we know that. So that's a good thing. We know that those antibody levels go up and the shots are still relatively well tolerated. The reactogenicity or the short-term side effects are acceptable, not that much different than they were after the second dose. Remember, after the second dose, they're more than the first dose because your immune system's already activated. And if you had COVID before, you're probably going to have more reactogenicity or side effects from the shot than you would if you never had COVID. But the third dose doesn't look any different than the second so far. So we can say that. The thing that you need to know is that there's a complexity to these vaccines that most people haven't heard about. And it's the word that you need to know is called epitopes. So epitope is actually the number of antigens that the vaccine is training your body to go after. Okay, so the Pfizer vaccine has 5 epitopes of the spike protein, which is 5 regions of the spike protein that produce the messenger RNA signal to tell your body this is the bad guy. There are 5 shorter regions in the Moderna vaccine that has 2 epitopes. The Moderna has 2 epitopes that are broader regions. And this is a fundamental difference between the 2 vaccines. Remember, they're both about 95% effective against the wild type variant.
Someone wants to know which one you received.
Okay, I got the Pfizer one. Okay, just lay out there. But I'm equally confident. Half of my staff got Moderna, half of my staff got Pfizer. And I think they're both excellent, but I'll get into that in a second.
Sorry,
That's another question.
another question on here, but whenever you.
Okay, well, let me just finish this point and I'll get to this question. This is a really important slide. So the Pfizer vaccine, then both shots have the same amount of stuff in them. But for the Pfizer one, it's split up into 5 parts. For the Moderna one, it's split up into 2 parts. And the question is it better to give higher amounts of 2 or lower amounts of 5? So the argument for the Pfizer is, well, when you get the actual infection, when you get a virus, you're creating hundreds of antibodies because your body is not just producing antibodies against the spike protein, it's producing antibodies against the whole virus. And so they thought that having more epitopes, Pfizer thought that having more epitopes was a better strategy. Moderna thought having fewer epitopes at a higher concentration was a better strategy. So that's going to be an interesting debate moving forward to see who wins that little battle. But they're both really, really good, and there's no evidence that one's better than the other right now. Okay, so again, we talked about the fact that it's only recommended for immunocompromised people, and we talked about transmissibility or contagion, and we don't know if the booster reduces contagion yet. We think that there, again, if you make more antibodies, and especially if those antibodies can reduce the viral load of the Delta variant in the nose, it could be, but I haven't seen any data on that yet.
Even with Israel, since I feel like they're 6 weeks ahead of us.
They're very proactive, but again, they're making their decisions based on observational data, not on clinical trials. Okay, and again, that's another debate. That's not a scientific debate so much as a public health political debate. Do you push forward on something before you have all the information based on your best guess, or do you wait till you have all the information? Okay, you had a question.
Yeah, someone online asked, does that mean that a low antibody test doesn't give enough information to warrant the third shot?
Right, so it's a really important question that I get asked a lot. When you get an antibody test, most of the commercial tests just tell you if you have IgG against COVID-19. It doesn't get into the specifics, and it doesn't quantify it. So it's very hard and very expensive to get a good quantified test. And with the vaccines, because they're looking at these specific epitopes, to do it right, you have to look for what's called neutralizing antibodies, meaning that they hit the spike protein in a certain place. So the spike protein is, one of the 8 proteins that the coronavirus makes. And there's a specific region that's required for that virus to infect human cells. So for this to be a neutralizing antibody, it has to hit the spike protein at the right spot. And standard commercial assays just don't do that. All they can tell you is if you've been exposed or not, and if you have antibodies. So there's really no strategy to look at antibodies. I get this all the time. You're relatively smart people say, oh, well, just check antibodies and I'll know what I have to do. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. To get that information, you have to do very, very high level tests that are not available to the general public. And even then, we don't know exactly how to interpret those. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here's something to consider. So right now, as I mentioned, the government recommendation is only boosters for the very high risk people, as we await level 1 evidence, which is going to come in 6 weeks. We'll actually get a New England Journal paper in 6 weeks that'll address this issue. So we can actually have very, very high level evidence coming up really soon. But what's the risk of waiting? So the Israelis decide we're not going to wait. Okay, but Israelis are impatient. I know that. We get that.
Somebody just said, is there a risk in waiting?
Right. Well, there is.
I feel like you're reading the text as they
Well,
come in.
I've gotten all these questions, as you can imagine.
It's because he has a vaccine.
That's right.
Just keep got the microchip.
Right.
That's right.
Microchip.
Well, there is a risk in waiting, and let me tell you what the risk is. So the risk in waiting is that you get infected tomorrow, right? That's what everybody's worried about, is that they don't have as much antibodies as they should, and that's the risk of waiting. However, there's also a risk of being hasty. So let's say that you get the vaccine tomorrow, and 2 months from now, it's not the Delta variant we're dealing with, but it's the Theta variant. And the vaccine that we're using now, which is the original vaccine, doesn't work against the Theta variant, and actually makes the Theta variant worse. And right, and now your body is going to have this horrible reaction when you give another vaccine for the Theta variant. The other thing that people probably have heard about, but probably don't have full awareness of it, is that Pfizer, Moderna, and others are creating a whole new vaccine that's specific to the Delta variant. And so that, we don't know what the approval process will be, but let's say that the FDA gets very comfortable with that very, very quickly and says, you know what, you don't have to do as much as you did last time, as long as people tolerate it, okay, let's assume it works. Well, why would you want to take the old vaccine when you could have the newer one that's targeted against the current virus? So there are issues when you start to think through them. Okay. Next. Yeah, it's just really hard to communicate. But please text and we'll read your question. Go back to that, the last. Go back. Yeah, and again, just make the point that if you've had the vaccine and you're test positive, it doesn't mean that the vaccines are horrible. There's no vaccine that's 100% effective, and vaccines are still considered a success if they prevent a serious infection. That's what this says. Okay, next slide. I think we get into the whole mask controversy. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this except to just remind people of something. And this is just to help them wear masks better. Keep on going. So I think I told this anecdote last time, but I tell it again because I think it's so insightful. Is that everybody's like so focused on the tactics, and if you depending on what they perceive you doing with the tactics, they label you. So I had this, I went to my gym. It was actually the day before Rosh Hashanah, and my schedule was different. So I went to the gym, it was a year ago today. I went to the gym, and I went to my gym when they had a mask mandatory session, and I didn't know that. So I go there, and they say, "Oh, Dr. Korn, you have to wear your mask." So okay, that's fine. Let me go to the car and get it. So I go to the car, I get my standard kind of paper mask, and then I get my N95 mask. And I was kind of curious to see how hard it was going to be to do my bike with the masks on. So I was like doing a little experiment. Okay, so keep in mind, I'm in a room that's 4 times as big as this room with 3 people in it. Okay, so we're all very, very highly socially distant. And so I get on the bike and I'm doing my thing, and I put the paper mask on. It's okay, well, it's a little bit of work of breathing here. I take the paper mask off, I put the N95 on. Okay, take it off. So I'm experimenting. So somebody comes over to me and says, "Oh, the reason we have such problems is because people like you that won't wear their masks." Okay, somebody comes up to me like that. And then, so I said, "Who are you? And are you a medical personnel?" And he says, "No, but I do a lot of reading." And I said, "Well, I actually do this for a living. And if you want, this is what I'm doing." Anyhow, so he basically walked away from me. He said, "It's best that you and I just don't talk."
Yeah.
All right. And I said, I agree with you on that. And then another lady comes over to me, and about 5 minutes later, he says, "I'm glad you straightened that guy out about masks, because this is all going to go away after the election." So literally in that room with 3 people, I had like all the extremes and attack on both sides. And I was just trying to assess the difference in work effort and whether or not having a mask and an N95 mask that has really small pores was going to make it more difficult to exercise, which it does, by the way. So yeah, that's what gets into masks. So the masks we see out there are cloth masks. And cloth masks are just face coverings that have large pores, and things like viruses can go right through them. So that's not ideal. I have many people who I've been wearing face masks, including my daughter, and cloth masks. And I said, "Well, when's the last time you washed the mask?" And they said, "I don't know, a couple months ago." All right. So think about that. If you're wearing the same cloth mask every day, you basically have a pathogen-soaked sponge in front of your nose and mouth. So I would tell you, again, cloth masks may have some efficacy. It's not what I recommend, but wash them every day. Okay.
Like underwear.
There you go. Okay. Then you have paper masks, and paper masks is what we actually use in the operating room, and they're built to prevent bacterial infections. They work very, very well for bacterial infections. But viruses are way smaller than bacteria, and they can go through the holes, the pores of a mask. And surgeons would never wear an N95 mask because the work of breathing would exhaust them during the course of a rigorous operation. Although if you have a COVID case, you have to do it. But these are paper masks, and that's what I use day to day when I'm here seeing patients. I use a paper mask, but what do I do at the end of the day? It goes in the trash. In fact, it goes in the trash multiple times in the day. And then you have N95 masks, which are really designed for viruses, but they have much smaller pore size. So that you can sense the work of breathing is greater when you wear an N95 mask. And so if you're working on a treadmill or a bike, and then an N95 mask, you can get tired much more quickly. It's kind of like I had the same feeling when I was doing that as when working out at altitude. Like when you go skiing, you go to a gym there, it's much harder to do it. Kind of had the same kind of feeling when I use that. So those are just some tidbits.
I think you touched on this a little bit. Someone asked, assume working on a booster specifically designed for Delta, what is the timeline, and should you wait for that versus a booster now?
Right. Yeah. So let me just finish this up, and I'll go right into that. So that's all we need to talk about masks. I think we covered that adequately. And I'll just cover this, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience. So the other thing that is really frustrating to me, and I think a miss from our public health folks, is that explaining to the public how you fight a pandemic. So there's basically 3 stages in fighting a pandemic. The first stage is that you know about a virus and you want to prevent it from getting into your region. So we knew the virus was in China. We knew it was on cruise ships back in January of 2020. And what do? We brought everybody back to the US that was exposed. We should never have done that. That was a huge mistake. They all should have been isolated, been kept offshore until they were negative. And that's what New Zealand did very successfully. Singapore, other places did it. Basically, they prevented the virus from coming in.
We did it with Ebola back
There you
in
go.
10 years ago.
Exactly. So that's the first stage. So we did not do that. That was a big mistake. Stage two is that it's in your country, it's in your jurisdiction, but the case numbers are relatively modest, and you can identify the sick people and identify all their contacts. So this happened in Korea and some other places. Korea got hit pretty hard in the beginning, but because of their experience with SARS, they had this whole public health mechanism of immediately identifying the cases, immediately identifying contacts, and isolating all those people. And their numbers went down quickly, and they never saw another surge as large. And you can do that again if you're prepared. You have the public health resources in place. You can do contact tracing. People will comply with it, and you have the cooperation of the public and the resources to do that. That's another way to fight it. We missed that boat. So the third stage is where we are and where most countries in the world are, which is that it's everywhere. And you just need to get to herd immunity, which means that the vast majority of the public cannot get sick from the virus. Even if it's positive in your nose, you won't get sick from it. And every virus is a little bit different in terms of what that herd immunity percentage is. For Delta, it's probably over 90% because of its infectiousness. And so we're in the state of Florida, we're probably about 70–75% immune. And we'll probably get to that 90% mark in the next 4 to 6 weeks, based on more people getting vaccinated and more people getting sick. Remember, there's only 2 ways to become immune: either get the disease or get the vaccine.
What if you do both? You're
Super.
really.
You should be in good
super-
shape, yeah. You should be in good shape.
Would
So-
that translate into a new variant? I would assume,
Mhm.
again, low level expert opinion
Yeah.
here. But I would assume that, with some of us having already had the Delta likely, because it was recent, and the vaccine, they're better protection against just the vaccine. So heaven forbid, there is a new variant.
Right.
I would assume infection plus vaccine is probably better protected than just the vaccine. Or we don't know.
We
We
don't
can't
know.
say that.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Often these viruses mutate to less virulent forms. So remember, there's only 7 types of coronaviruses that infect humans. Coronaviruses usually do not infect humans. 4 of the 7 create very benign syndromes. So imagine if it just mutates to a typical coronavirus that you have some sniffles, you barely even know you're sick, and that ends up being mass vaccination. That could happen. It hasn't happened yet, but it could. So the question there was about the newer versions of the vaccine. It's hard to say. It really depends on how the FDA views it. Remember, the beauty of the messenger RNA technology is that you can really create a vaccine within days of isolating the new virus. But mass producing it is another question. The companies are probably much better at that at this point. But the real thing is FDA approval and how much evidence they need for the new version of it. So my guess, honestly, is that you wouldn't see anything that is Delta specific for another 3 months. And that would require high levels of FDA cooperation, but it's technically feasible. Other questions from the audience?
We have a few, but when you get to the questions.
All right, well, I think I've said what I need to say. I think we covered this. I just did a calculation. Oh, actually, one other point. One of the huge challenges we have here are kids under 12. I mentioned that at the beginning, and I just want to end on that. So we have solutions for 12 and up, but we don't have a solution now for 12 and under. And we're not over this thing until 90% of kids are immune. And at this point, that means they're going to get infected because we don't have a vaccine. So that's the other place where I wish the government would be more proactive. I don't see the risk in kids is big. In fact, it's probably less. And we know that you have to give a smaller dose of the flu vaccine, another vaccine for kids. But unfortunately, it's going to be very, very political and very hard to get through. And the other good news is that kids tend to have very mild illness when they get COVID-19, but some get sick. And then, of course, some spread it to the people who are more vulnerable. So that's actually the biggest public health challenge right now is how to deal with kids going back to school, how to deal with kids who are under 12. And then the other big news, we didn't even mention it, but probably the biggest news is that Pfizer got their vaccine approved yesterday. So that means that a doctor can write your prescription for it now. Now, what I don't know, and we'll find out, I'm sure, this week, is under emergency authorization, which is what all the other vaccines were under previous, that was government distribution, et cetera, and the government also paid for it. People didn't have to pay for the vaccine. I don't know what's going to happen with the approved vaccine. A doctor can write a prescription, you go to a pharmacy. Does the government pay for that? I don't know the answer to that question yet, but we'll learn. I'm sure there'll be a lot of political pressure for the government to pay for it, but I don't know the answer to that.
Can we touch on the kids a little bit more? Because I
Sure.
know beforehand, people were very interested in this. Two parts of the children that are really pressing a lot of parents' minds is, are there vaccine studies going on for children right now? And with masks, in preschool has
Right.
been a big debate. Again, there's a lot of theories, like, the mouth breathers who end up with long face syndrome. I don't think that will be in effect because they're not wearing the mask 24 hours a day. But that, or the language development and, some other level
Sure.
4 evidence things out there that are being thrown out there. So if you can touch on
Sure.
where we are with vaccines in children and what your expert opinion is on masks in the preschool children,
Right,
ages
okay.
2 to 5.
Yeah, so the question, they're actually great questions and they're very specific answers. So there are vaccine studies going on for kids right now. We've participated in them down to age 12, and we're looking at maybe doing it below 12. You can imagine that they were just more challenging in general because how do you get the kids to comply with things? And for these studies to work, you have to bring them in when they're symptomatic. That's tricky because they can't come in by themselves. They need other people involved with them, and they're bringing in potentially exposing other people to their illness, et cetera. So the logistics of a pediatric vaccine study is just much more difficult than an adult study. I say adult study, if you have a runny nose, you're in the study, you drive yourself to our tent outside and we test you and we tell you eventually if you have COVID or not. In kids study, it's just much more challenging. But the answer is we are doing those studies. Then as far as the mask is concerned, my goodness, I don't think they work in kids. Again, they just don't work because they're going to be touching them, they're going to be taking them off, their cloth masks going to be dirty, they're touching each other. It's so hard to keep them apart. It's just really hard. Now, they protect the teachers. So I disagree with some public health authorities on this. I actually think you would have much more political traction than say, look, the kids can wear the mask, but we know that they tend to have very mild illnesses, and it's so difficult to keep them apart. And are they going to have clean masks? Are they going to learn as well? All those things you brought up, but the teachers need to be protected, and the other staff need to be protected. So to me, a better strategy would be to create like a barrier between the kids and the teachers, which is not perfect, but that's more effective from a public health standpoint than
I don't know that that's realistic. Like what kind of barrier?
Plexiglass.
Sad.
Yeah, what's sad, but again, if you want something to work.
Sorry. Sorry.
Right, again,
Band-Aid over.
But think about it. When you think about it, if that's what you're trying to do, that makes sense. And again, we don't have good evidence for this, but it's a big problem. It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. And then everybody gets emotional about it because there is no specific answer. But I see plenty of kids with their masks and they take them off, they're throwing them at each other. It's not going to work. It's just really difficult.
But is it better than no mask?
We don't know. The answer is we don't have evidence for that. But again, remember, we're trying to get to herd immunity. So the irony of this is that if they work, they can extend the pandemic. So that means they're not working. If they extend the pandemic and they work. So it's a really interesting question. And again, my answer is not political whatsoever. It's really just public health and practical. But the more you think about it, kids tend to have very mild illness with COVID-19, but they're dealing with adults that have much more serious illnesses potentially that we don't have any other solution from right now, unfortunately, because the vaccines are not authorized for use. We don't even know what the dose is for them. And they don't use them well.
And you're talking about young kids, right? Not.
Well, everybody under 12, but yeah, that's another point. Obviously, a 5-year-old is different than 11-year-old.
Right.
So, but, the fact is that they're gonna, in a multi-child family, they're gonna give each other the virus. One kid gets it, everybody's gonna get it. So it's extraordinarily difficult to control viruses in kids. They scare me the most, by the way. Like, and my personal protection, when I hear that somebody has a kid, I stay 3 feet away from everybody. But if they have a kid, I stay like 9 feet away, just because I know the way these viruses work.
They're like little petri dishes.
Yeah, no, it is. And again, if you remember in the old days when I was growing up, when people had chicken pox parties, I heard that, where it was so infectious that you knew that you're going to get it eventually. So you might as well get it when you're young and less likely to have severe complications. And that was the strategy. I got through it okay.
They were having COVID parties at the beginning of.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, exactly. So it's not a crazy strategy, but it's a really difficult question. I wish we had a vaccine for them. Other questions?
Do you have some?
We do. Someone just asked, with flu season coming up and with the flu shot coming out, is this just, how do you know if you have the flu or if you have COVID? Should you get the flu shot in addition, to this COVID vaccine? And is that too much going into your body at once?
You should get the flu shot. And that also changes every year. So it'll be interesting to see what the formulation is for this year. And there are manufacturers that are working on a combined COVID and flu vaccine. Remember I talked about the epitopes for COVID. The typical flu vaccine has 4 epitopes in it. We call that quadrivalent, meaning that there are 4 different strains of the flu that they're protecting against.
Are there different brands of flu shot like there
There
are?
are, yes. You can take flu vaccines through the nasal way or injections. Is it called Flu Mist? Is the trade name for the nasal spray?
Okay, there's a few in here. Should a 7-year-old go ahead and get the 3rd shot now?
Again, those become medical questions that require you to consult with your physician, because if you're 7 years old and you had a melanoma treatment 5 years ago, you're different than if you're 7 years old and just have 1 pill for high blood pressure and otherwise doing well. In general, if you're healthy and 70, I'm not recommending it for my patients, but I can't give that type of medical advice without knowing the situation of the particular person.
Okay, this is something you've already answered a few times. Okay, am I understanding that there is really no value in getting an antibody test?
Only if you want to know if you're infected or the vaccine had some impact, but it's not going to guide therapy. If you're unvaccinated and you want to know if you had COVID, then the antibody test can give you some information. Otherwise, I know a whole lot.
I have one from the early ones that said, is it currently advisable to fly out of the country?
Safer.
Yeah, depends what country you go to. I'll tell you, it's funny. My best friend, the guy actually from the San Francisco Chronicle I was just talking about, I saw right before he was taking off to go to France, because he does this every year, and he loves his late August trip to France every year. And he didn't do it last year, of course, but he wanted to do it this year. But he was so freaked out about doing it. And he asked me if it was reckless for him to do it. And what I told him, and it's the way I feel about my own travel, I don't think your risk is super high on an airplane. I don't think your risk is super high if you're vaccinated and you're smart and you social distance and you do all that. But the hassle factor of traveling right now, especially internationally, is just off the charts. And that's what worries me the most. And I don't do well with being hassled. So maybe I'm different than most, but you're hearing all these stories about how they're changing the rules on a daily basis. And sometimes you have to wait and get COVID tested at airports, and then flights get rerouted because of outbreaks in places. So it's the unpredictability of how the authorities can deal with things, to me, scares me more than the actual infection. Because the truth is that if you wear your mask, you're on a plane, likelihood of getting infected on that is really, really small. But if there are massive lines and somebody's sneezing and wearing a cloth mask around their chin, then that raises your anxiety level, and want to deal with that. And then you have just all these hassles. I'll give you an example. I just got back from Philadelphia to visit my daughter. And so we get off the plane, And they direct us to the baggage claim area. And there's like 3 carousels, and they don't say which one our luggage is coming on, is going to come on. And they have all these monitors that say, wear your mask, wear your mask, wear your mask, but none of them said like where to get my bag. And there was no employees there because they were separating the employees from people because of COVID. So I eventually like had to fight my way through like several barriers. I finally found an employee. He was like, wearing a shield and a mask and everything, and made me stay like 10 feet away from him. And he says, I don't know what is coming on. It'll be there eventually. So again, people, the whole travel industry has had to adjust, and I get it. They're trying to protect their people, but it's a hassle. So when I answer that question about traveling more from a convenience standpoint, maybe than from a infection standpoint, I think, again, if you're smart, you won't get infected.
Yeah, and going off that, someone said.
Don't go if you're unvaccinated, though, I wouldn't go.
Okay, so that goes to the question, are under 12 okay flying?
Yeah, and again, those are tricky ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a toughie. That's a toughie.
Another question, is there a new?
I again, as a passenger, that would make me concerned. So again, I'm coming from a sort of an expert standpoint and knowing all the data. I was very pleased when I got on the Philadelphia flight and I didn't see the kids. And I probably would ask to have my seat changed if I saw somebody younger, especially, because like kids are sniffling all the time. And it just, again, it's a little crazy, but that would be my concern.
Take the 5 a.m. flight.
But it just, you're just playing the odds, that's all. Is that if they're under 12, they're not vaccinated, that there's a huge surge right now and they're going to be the center of it.
Is there a new guideline from the CDC suggesting religious institutions should not hold high holiday services this year, assuming protections are in place, such as the synagogue requiring masks, social distancing, and or vaccine verification?
I haven't seen anything specific about the high holidays. I'm curious to see how the synagogues deal with that. Obviously, some of these are state by state rules. Like it or not, Florida is much more open to having people congregate, and we'll see what the synagogues decide to do. Again, I think the risk, my personal opinion, if one synagogues wants to hire me as a consultant, I'm available. Joking, I'll do it for free. But I would say that
They're not doing children's programming in person.
Exactly.
They're very much, I can't speak for all of the synagogues, but I do know that several of our synagogues in this community have decided to not hold in-person programming for children, not outside, not inside. They are sending pre-recorded.
I would embrace that. I think that is actually very sensible. And I would say, as far as sitting and enjoying the service, if you're vaccinated and you're not on top of somebody, your risk is extremely low. No kissing on the receiving line. Yeah, and then, but again, the sanctuary, the likelihood of getting infected amongst vaccinated people in the sanctuary is extremely low. And I'd actually support a vaccine-only policy in a synagogue or a church or any place where people are congregating.
What does this whole thing look like in a year?
And that's not level 1 evidence. That's just personal opinion.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
What does this whole thing look like in a year or 2 years?
Yeah, who knows?
Great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, my crystal ball wasn't working this morning, so I can't answer that exactly. But I'm very hopeful that once we get to that herd immunity, this goes away relatively quickly. God willing, there's no further horrible variants, and this turns into a usual coronavirus, which is something we deal with all the time and doesn't create a lot of headaches. So again, if I had a bet, I would say that 2022 will be a very much more pleasant year in terms of traveling, in terms of lower anxiety levels.
For those starting the COVID vaccine series now, for the first time, the CDC says 3 doses of mRNA after the the CDC says the 3rd dose after of mRNA after the 2nd dose. How do we approach the 3rd dose scenario for the new person starting the COVID vaccine?
I don't think the CDC is saying you get a 3rd dose.
I didn't see the CDC.
Yeah. No. I think the government has approved paying for it after 8 months, starting in September.
totally lost in translation.
Yeah, yeah.
Because they're saying, by them saying it's approved, you're assuming,
This thing is paid for. They'll
Right,
pay for it.
right.
Yeah.
But I mean,
It's
that's a
confusing.
huge thing. I mean, you're right about the news, that you can read the title of an article that grabs your attention, but really what it has to say is totally different sometimes in the article. So, but that's the whole thing, like saying, by the government saying, oh yeah, we think this is, we're gonna by September 20th, you can start getting your third, but that doesn't mean that you should. And I think that's where a lot of the mistrust comes out from the government with things.
Yeah, I agree. Well said. So again, interest of time, one last question.
Okay, wow, wait. Okay, this one's a good one. What are your thoughts about getting the third shot opposite brand of what you got the first
Yeah,
one?
that's really a good question. That's a great final question. I would recommend staying with the same vaccine that you had previously. And just because we don't know what happens when you switch. And as I said, they're different. All three that are authorized in the country are different. So you can't assume that you're going to get equal protection when you switch from one to the other.
There's one more good question.
Okay,
How do you feel about pregnancy and getting the vaccine?
no problem. Pregnant women should get the vaccine.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Great questions. You guys did a lot of work, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
A lot of thank yous on the chat.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, if you like this kind of format, sign up for our MedEvidence hour.
Can you
Painless.
go back to that slide?
Yeah,
so people
yeah,
can,
bunch in with that.
Write it down.
Yeah.
I do want to let you know, Dr. Corn, that Alan Margulies, our executive director, and Jen Plotkin both just wanted me to tell you how much they appreciate
Oh, my
your time
pleasure.
with us this evening.
And
And
my
our
regards to both.
entire community really just respects and loves that we have you as a resource, and we appreciate your time with us. Thank
pleasure.
you.
My pleasure.
They can see that. Oh, go one more.
All right. Well, happy holidays, everybody, and we'll convene again soon.
Yeah, if you guys want to subscribe to our newsletter, we send out weekly newsletters with current enrolling studies, MedEvidence.
I'm going to let everybody who signed up this evening, can you send that to me? So I can send them a link to sign up if they'd like.
Well done.
Okay.
Anything else?
No, you get really covered most of these originally.
Good job.
Thank you. No, good job to you.
Are we signed out?
We do have that one booster coming this one.
No,
Okay.
I'm gonna end it in just a second.
Somebody.
This you, are we still on? If we are, I'm going to read a quick wrap up. if that's
Okay, yeah, we're on.
I just want
Well, I
to
think
thank
that's
everyone
control.
for joining us this evening and remind you that our
Yeah,
Jewish
yeah.
Federation and Foundation is currently kicking off our annual campaign.
I'm
This
curious
year's
if they're
theme is
definitely
here for the good.
tailoring it
And
towards.
we're clearly here for the
I-
good, and we thank
I'm
Dr.
ready to
Corin
restore
for
trade.
joining us.
That'd be interesting.
So
That
very
way we
much.
can recruit them.
We invite you to continue supporting our organization, signing in, watching our programming in Northeast Florida,
Right.
Israel, and throughout the world.
Delete it.
Good night, everybody. Sure. Okay, now really sign us out of here.
Okay, someone asked, can we access the recording, and that'll be on the
Yes,
newsletter, so
I
I
will
will.
send out a follow-up email that has the recording in it in case it's.
Okay.
Okay. I have a.
Night, everybody.
Come vaccinated, we'll have a test
Right.
within